Welcome to another presentation of the Relationship Toolbox, a show about learning the skills for building positive relationships with others. Today our topic is going to be how to be mindful of what is going on around us and the effect that that has on others in relationships with us. So Tracy, maybe we can start with you. Could you tell us a little bit more about what do we mean by being mindful, and why is that so important in relationships?
Okay. Well, being mindful is the ability to kind of become self-aware of what's happening in and around us in any given moment. It's about being kind of absorbed in the present time and without judging or trying to convince yourself of anything or evaluating yourself, just kind of naturally getting interested in what you're experiencing at that moment. And there are researchers who have described different steps about ways to reach that awareness within yourself. And a couple of things that you can do, there are actually 5 of them. You want to slow down and be very deliberate and focus on your breathing. And we'll actually do an exercise in a few minutes so that we can kind of try that, and you can try it at home as well. But that is something that people don't pay enough attention to. They don't stop and pay attention to their breathing and notice what they're doing and breathe deeply. We all breathe very shallowly most of the time. So thinking about your breathing is one step, and being fully in the moment by concentrating on your senses, right? We all remember when we were kids, you have your sight, your hearing, your smell, your taste, and touch. And those are your 5 senses, and you want to be paying attention to those 5 things and literally going through each one and noticing what you're hearing, what you're smelling, what you're seeing. So kind of going through that is another way to kind of be in the moment. Being observant of what's going on within yourself. Maybe directly around you and within yourself, what you're feeling, what you're noticing about yourself. And identifying your feelings and paying attention to your thoughts, that's another thing that you want to be able to do so that you can just take a moment to actually notice what you're thinking. A lot of times people's thoughts are very quick and they go through them, and we talk about multitasking all the time, and so people are
do it.
Right. Yeah, right. A lot of people say they can't do it, and there's actually research that shows it's not beneficial. Right, it's not right. It's really not possible. Not if you're going to be mindful and be present and in the moment. It doesn't work well to multitask. So just identifying those feelings and paying attention to what you're actually thinking. And the other, this is a key part of it, is to suspend any judgment. So most of the time when we're looking at ourselves, when we're looking at other people, we're evaluating things based on how we're judging it, right? Are we doing it right? Are we doing it wrong? Are we doing perfect comes up, I can't be the perfect parent. I can't be the perfect, that's a judgment, and you don't want to be judging yourself. You just want to be noticing what you do in a given situation. And then that expands out to other people. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but that expands out to other people as well, so that you're not judging them as much, you're noticing what they do in a given situation, particularly when you're in conflict.
In fact, I think in some of the positive research, positive psychology research, they have determined that our brains are actually wired to pick up the negative much faster than the positive, and to give it more weight with it. So that makes what you just talked about, it really is a skill that we need to work on, to practice. It's not going to just come because we decide we're going to do it.
Right, it might be automatic that we go into that mode, but we can also train ourselves to get back out of that mode.
To get out of the negative.
I think that people don't, myself included, don't value this work because they're so busy. You think, well, I don't really have time for this because I really have to get to the meat of the interaction or the transaction, and I've got this list, and I have come late to the party, but I understand the value of this now, of being connected and slowing down and being at a deeper interaction with people and with myself.
Sure.
And it's beneficial in that sense, and we'll talk about some of the benefits as we go along, but it's beneficial in that sense also, because even if you take that time and you do spend some time on it, it actually makes you more effective in your communication. It makes you more effective in your life, in your work, in your relationships. So even though you're taking that time and it feels like time, it's beneficial in that sense. It's more effective. So
until you've seen it work, though, it's hard to convince yourself that giving up the time to work on this mindfulness.
Well, not only are we wired, you know, to pick up on the negative things when we pick up. But also I think our society teaches us to be very task-oriented and competitive, which tends to work against some of these things that you're talking about.
Right. And moving in the fast lane.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
Right, so speaking of taking some time.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Yeah.
So if we're going to take, and we're going to invite viewers to do this as well, if we're going to take 30 seconds to just do this exercise, to become a little bit more mindful, and if you'll join me, I'm going to explain what we'll do, and then we can actually do it. And you just want to kind of, we're not maybe going to do this exactly here, but get in a comfortable position. And so if you want to just get in that position and make yourselves comfortable. And
so just to make sure you're inviting the audience here, the viewers, to do the same thing that we're going to be doing here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So take a moment, get in a comfortable position, and then focus on slowly calming your body. And we're going to start breathing, and we're going to do this for 30 seconds. While we're doing that, we're not going to start the 30 seconds quite yet, but while we're doing that, you're going to notice, you're going to use your senses, and you're going to become aware of things that you hear, smell, see, taste, and feel. Maybe notice what feelings you're experiencing and what thoughts you're having, and then we'll talk about it afterwards. So let's just take 30 seconds, and I'll watch a clock, but just take 30 seconds to breathe all the way in through your nose and all the way out through your mouth. And notice what your senses are picking up. Okay. And just slowly start to breathe how you normally breathe. And then just ask yourself, and we can ask each other, but you can ask yourselves at home, what are some of the things that you became aware of? If you thought about your senses, what did you pick up on?
I heard things. I heard the machinery in the room, and I heard what I think must have been train cars or trucks or something, heavy equipment moving and shifting. And then things would recede, and then I'd hear something else. So that was the first thing I was aware of, was just the ambient noise that I would not have been aware of if we'd been conversing, or if I'd been doing something else. That would have just been background. So they kind of came to the foreground.
Did you notice anything?
I noticed that I also felt the rumbling that you talked about from the train behind us going by. I could actually feel it. And being aware of what seemed like almost fans here in here, which I normally wouldn't be paying any attention to. And also I started to be more aware of my own heartbeat, you know, with that.
Yeah, and I heard us breathing. So I could hear that. I became very aware of hearing us breathing. And that's not something you hear very often, right? That you don't pay much attention to.
Breathing isn't a natural thing for me.
Yeah.
I'm aware of my breathing.
You are?
Yeah.
So our viewers might be saying to themselves, so okay, we do this and we become aware of things in our environment. What does that have to do with our relationships? And what benefit is there to this?
Well, I think one of the things is that just noticing things that you don't typically notice has got to be a benefit in your interpersonal relationships. Something that you might not have noticed. By slowing things down and noticing, you make it information that you didn't have before about yourself. Gives you think time too. I think we're always trying to refute or get to the next thing, that we're not necessarily taking in the information that's coming to us. Today in school, in the elementary school, I was in a classroom where the teacher was encouraging kids to put their hands down while other students were talking, because they were still showing that they were very focused on what they wanted to talk about, and they weren't showing respect to the person who had the floor. And that can happen in our personal exchanges. We're so wrapped up in the rebuttal, or that I'm going to listen just long enough to get enough information shoot something back to you.
Which we've talked about
Yeah.
in reflective listening, right? We've talked about that before, and it's a key
Absolutely.
point. Yeah.
But by slowing things down, you notice things, you might just, and you were saying we're just accepting what's happening. We're not judging the noise or the breathing or the, the itch or whatever. You were just being aware of it. And we could be aware of the tone of the conversation or the content and just, okay, just notice it and let it go and think about it.
Right, and being less judgmental about yourselves, and over time that makes you less judgmental of others, because if you just notice what you do, and if you're in conflict or whatever it is, if you're having a tough conversation and you're noticing how you react and you notice what you do in those situations without judgment, then you can take that step back. It's easier to do that. Take that step back and say it's okay to do this.
Right, that's the key to it.
Yeah,
To say it's okay for me to feel this way.
Yeah, exactly.
I often discount the mind-body connection too, and how the worries in our mind can trigger physical aspects of our body, and vice versa when we are mindfully trying to slow everything down and be aware of our physical feelings, how that can release the tensions in our mind too. And I don't make that connection as often as I should.
And
Language,
that makes us less, and that makes us less defensive also, and less reactive, because we're not constantly in that fight or flight mode. We're
Right.
taking that
Or the
step
attack.
back, right? So it makes us less defensive in our communications.
Language is another thing too, I think, that begins to focus us. And when we start to say to ourselves, or even about someone else, well, they shouldn't, and we start using the word should, that becomes a judgmental thing, either against ourselves or someone else. And that takes us in the wrong direction again.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so it's another thing to be mindful of, is
Yes,
our language,
our
and
language,
how we use it. I often talk to people who say, well, I'm not going to do this, and I can't do this, and I'm not going to do this, and I'm not going to let so-and-so. And I always try and say, just shift it. Take a minor shift to say what you will do, what you can do, and focus on that. That's an action-oriented dialogue.
And if we've slowed things down, we can choose our words better.
Right. Well, even in
heat
the
of the
I message
moment.
that we've talked about before too, when people say, well, this is what I will do differently, and they actually are talking about what they won't do.
Right.
And we have to turn around and say, no, tell us what you will do.
Yes, absolutely. That's
with it.
huge. Yeah. So when we do all of those things, as we talked about, we decrease our negative feelings and our negative energy, and our minds become more open to having some flexible feelings and flexible thinking, and that makes us more open to options and what things that we can and will do. So those are really key. And we want to train our minds. This takes effort. This isn't something that just happens overnight. Yeah, it does take practice and training our minds. And Tom, I think you said something about overtraining. Is that what you said?
Yes,
Is that the terminology you said to me outside of
Over-practice it,
here? Over-practice, right. If you over-practice and you overtrain yourself, then it becomes more and more natural for you.
And less likely to be led astray under stress.
Yes,
if
right.
we've over-practiced it. Yes.
Right. So, yeah. So
it definitely is a training of our mind to refocus in different ways.
Absolutely.
So I guess another question that perhaps our viewers are thinking of is, how do we get past this judgmental thinking if we're sort of hot-wired for it anyway? That defensiveness, how do we get beyond the fight, flight, or freeze, which generally turns into defensiveness with it. And once we're going down that road, it's pretty hard to stop it at that moment. One of the things that comes to mind is a recent event that happened where in an airplane, when the window blew out of that, and the female pilot in this case was commended afterward for her calmness and being able to resort to her training and under these grueling circumstances to be able to control that plane, keep people doing the tasks that they need to be doing, and get that plane down safely with it. So I thought there was a real analogy there of training ourselves not to react necessarily to what that other person is saying. And so what do we replace it with, and so forth.
And in part, I think what strikes me is when you're doing the other things, when you're breathing and you're noticing without judgment, and you practice that over and over and over again, you might go to fight or flight or freeze initially, because maybe that's where you automatically go, and that's okay. And then take that step back and say, no, am I really in danger? Do I really need to be in fight or flight mode? And usually the answer is no. Obviously, there might be some circumstances where you do need to be in that mode. But for the most part, we operate in that mode unnecessarily. So if we go there, go there. Allow yourself to go there, notice it, and say, do I really need to be here? Probably not. Take that step back and ask yourself. Yeah.
If it's hard for us to notice our own behaviors, sometimes it's a good exercise to pretend you're somebody else watching you or observing you, and it gives you a different perspective and kind of permission to observe and judge your own behavior, and you can't always name it yourself. I think that we wanted to get to an example so that we could maybe give people an example of when this might be hard to do. Tom, did you have one in mind?
I did. I thought this is something that maybe not all our viewers are experiencing, but percentage-wise, we know at least 50% of the population may be experiencing this, and that is a divorce. And some of the complications that we experience in co-parenting when we have children, and we're co-parenting with another person who we are divorced from. So I thought we might use an example like that, and here's the scenario that I thought might be helpful to demonstrate what we've been talking about. So let's suppose that I am the one who's divorced, and I need to call my former spouse to talk about some statements that our daughter has made to me about her experience in visiting my former wife. And the other person, my former wife has remarried. So a lot of the tension, a lot of the problem that my daughter is talking about seems to center on the relationship she's having with this new step-parent, I guess you could call it at that point. So the new step-parent seems to be imposing different rules in her house, different from what I would impose here in mine. So I know that from past experience, if I pick up the phone and I start to talk to my former wife about this, we're going to be in a yelling match in no time, or at least our voices will be raising. And it won't take too long before someone's going to hang up on the phone, and we won't have resolved anything. And we will not have been a very good model for our daughter to visualize this. So I thought maybe we could use, how do we use the skills of being mindful to improve this type of communication?
Well, I think being mindful about the preparation. You could be mindful during the conversation, but being mindful ahead of time. There's something to be said for thinking about it up front and preparing. Getting yourself
before you make the call.
Before you make the call, Think about the pitfalls. Think about how you've contributed, what the triggers are. What is it that she might say that's going to set you off? Be ready for that, and practice. Talk it through. Get the words there. Make the right choices.
Because the temptation is to text something back or to fire something back right away,
or just
which is going to escalate things with it. And if I take the time to figure out, okay, what is it about her tone of voice or the words that she's using on the phone, or perhaps an attitude that I'm sensing? Why is that so triggering for me?
And can you maybe let it go in the moment this time and not respond to it, and then just persist in your communication with the information that you want to share
without it with another skill.
And reframe it, as we've talked about.
Yeah, exactly.
And again, you might reverse roles and say, okay, what if I were her looking at me? What is it that I'm doing that might be provocative? What am I doing? Oh, right. Well, maybe
I do a little needling.
I say something about her new husband, or maybe there's something that I could avoid doing.
And here's where that evaluating can really get in the way, because, excuse me, rarely is it we're doing equally negative things. I may think that I'm doing much better behavior, much better communication
Of course you are.
than she's using.
what we
So
all
why
think.
should I be the one to have to make all this effort? Well, the answer, there are many answers to that with it, but by making the effort and doing what you suggested
Turning
with
the
this,
tables,
I need to find out, so what do I think I'm doing, and what is the effect of it perhaps on her? And what might I do differently?
Right.
Yeah.
And our choice of words.
Right. And coming up with that, like you're saying, Marcia, thinking those things through beforehand. Maybe doing that breathing. Do that beforehand so that when you call, you're calm, or when, if that's what you're doing, or emailing. Taking that time to be mindful, to really connect with yourself and understand what you're feeling, what you're sensing, what you're noticing about yourself. And don't be judgmental. Don't be judgmental about yourself. Don't be judging her. And when you do that, it's very hard to get defensive or feel defensive when you're not judging. If you're truly not judging.
Or feeling that you've been judged.
Right. Now you may feel judged, right? Because maybe you are being judged because you're the one practicing this mindfulness initially, right? But the more you can let go and get out of that fight or flight mode, you know you're not being defensive. You know you're not being judgmental, and that helps you get through that conversation.
Right. And I think there's a adage in psychology basically about when you take away something that you're doing, you leave a vacuum. So that oftentimes doesn't help, with it. You need to replace it with something else. So if I'm thinking in my sort of analysis of what I've been doing or how I might be coming across to her, what might I substitute for doing that, and then see what the effect would be. And we've talked in the past about, you just mentioned one about refocusing a statement. So if I get a real negative comment from her, I might rephrase that into something that is less hurtful to me. And then say, hey, I did a pretty good job of that, and now I can work with it because it doesn't sting as much. Especially if she picks up that same new term and uses it, we're on a better level at that point.
It's like the conflict cycle. It's changing the way you're thinking a little bit, and that changes the way you feel, and it changes your behavior, and then that changes the whole conversation.
Yeah,
so
but it comes from that being mindful of taking the time, the energy, the commitment to figuring out what is happening and how might I be a part of that.
You still have difficult conversation. You still have information that you think is going to be prickly.
Yes.
That you have to share in the least prickly way.
And coming up with different ways to say things is key there, right?
Well, and also, there is no guarantee that even if I do these better communication skills, that the other party is going to automatically respond to them, or that I'm going to get what I want from the other person. So if I'm not careful, that can lead me into another trap. I've done all these skills, I've practiced them, I've been aware of this now, and look what I get. You're still treating me this way. So I feel now justified for throwing those all out the window. So now you're really going to get it.
And sometimes that self-awareness is okay too, because that leads to self-acceptance, and then you can be okay with someone saying no to you more easily. So all of those things lend to all of that as well.
Slow it down and say, okay, I haven't started off so well. Let's try this again. Or
maybe just I did well, but it didn't register with the other party the way I had hoped. So I'm going to pull back and collect myself again so I don't start reacting. And I will, at another time, do it again. And eventually, I'm going to gain something.
Again.
Yes.
Right. And if nothing else, you may or may not change that other person, right? We know that. We know we don't have control over changing that other person. You're going to feel differently. You're going to feel more accepting.
And that's the change in the cycle.
Exactly. And then that will start, and hopefully, it will change the cycle with that person, whether their behavior is changing or not, which likely will happen eventually. But if it doesn't, you still feel better.
And it's become a better model for my daughter. So instead of my daughter seeing me blow up and yell with it and think, oh, well, that's how they deal with things, she can see me now reflecting on it and saying, this is very frustrating. I put words to the emotions, labels to them, and made choices about how I will respond to that with it. So there's a lot in this reflectiveness and mindfulness to be aware of,
Yes.
the energy that it takes to do.
Yeah. And just focusing on it and taking the time to do it. It's really not a lot of time if you really think about it. It's really not.
Oh, it
We took
happens so
30
quickly.
seconds. Yeah,
Yes.
you just have to notice it so that you take the 30 seconds to breathe and so that you take the time to think about things and what you're noticing. But it really doesn't take a long time.
Yeah.
It's noticing it and then doing it.
And the
You
other
may
thing,
hear things differently in this conversation that you're having, which is new because you're crafting it in a new way, that you didn't hear before because you were so ready for the cycle of conflict.
yes.
Yeah.
That if you're really there in the moment, you might be able to respond to differently.
Well, how often have we heard people in mediation say, oh, I know exactly what she's going to say.
Right.
So when we approach a situation, a conversation that way, as you say, Marcia, we may not even hear the nuance of change that did come through because we know
so
what's going to
ready.
happen. Yes,
For the pattern.
Right.
yes.
We're out of time, Tom.
We're okay. Well,
Again.
so we certainly hope that our discussions and demonstrations today have given you some thoughts and some skills to think about in your relationships. We welcome our viewers to express their opinions by writing us on email on the address that will appear on the screen.
In our next episode, we'll be exploring how to craft an effective apology and what you can expect in the architecture of a good apology. Thank you for watching the Relationship Toolbox. We hope you'll join us again.